It was a typical day outside Buckingham Palace, one of London's most iconic landmarks. The sun shone brightly, casting its golden rays across the stone walls of the palace. Tourists wandered around, clicking photos and admiring the historic beauty of the building. In the midst of this crowd stood a royal guard, dressed in his signature red uniform and tall, fluffy bearskin hat. His face was stoic, showing no emotion at all, a perfect picture of discipline and professionalism. The crowd admired him from a distance, knowing that he was there to protect the palace and uphold a centuries-old tradition. But today, things were about to change. Among the crowd, there was one man who was not so interested in the palace or its history. He was filled with frustration and anger, and his behavior immediately stood out. He wasn't there to enjoy the sights. Instead, he seemed determined to cause trouble. As he walked closer to the royal guard, his eyes locked onto the soldier. There was a certain look of challenge in his gaze, and it became clear that he wasn't just observing the guard like the rest of the tourists. This man, filled with hostility, began to approach the guard in a way that suggested he was ready to provoke a reaction. He made sure to stand directly in front of the guard, blocking his path, and then started speaking to him. His words were filled with negativity and offensive remarks. He made no attempt to be polite or respectful. Instead, he aimed to push the boundaries and see how far he could go. Despite his harsh words, the royal guard did not flinch. He stood still, perfectly still, not letting a single muscle on his face move. The guard's silence and stillness only seemed to fuel the man's anger. The more the guard ignored him, the more irritated he became. The man's taunts grew louder and more aggressive, each word meant to test the guard's composure. He shouted at the guard, attempting to insult him in front of the growing crowd. People around started to take notice, some even murmuring in disbelief at the man's rude behavior. But the guard remained calm. He didn't react, didn't even acknowledge the man's presence with a glance. His training had prepared him for this exact moment. As a royal guard, his job was not only to protect the palace, but also to withstand all sorts of challenges without ever showing a sign of weakness. The crowd, curious about what would happen next, started to gather even closer. Everyone wondered if the guard would break character and respond to the man. But instead of getting angry, the royal guard remained as composed as ever, his eyes focused straight ahead, as if the man didn't even exist. This only seemed to make the situation worse for the troublemaker. Frustrated, the man began to pace around the guard, his face red with anger. He couldn't believe that someone could stay so calm in the face of such insults. It was at that moment, in the midst of the taunting and tension, that the man made a decision that would change everything. He suddenly turned to his dog, which was standing beside him, and without warning, he released the leash. The dog, a large aggressive breed, immediately darted forward, heading straight for the guard. The crowd gasped as the dog charged, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. People weren't sure what would happen next. Would the guard defend himself? Would the situation spiral out of control? The moment was filled with tension, and everyone held their breath, waiting for what would come next. As the man released the leash, the dog, a large and powerful animal, immediately lunged toward the royal guard. The dog's eyes were wild with aggression, and its barking filled the air, echoing loudly in the otherwise calm surroundings of Buckingham Palace. The crowd's gasps of surprise mixed with nervous whispers as they watched in disbelief. People instinctively took a step back, unsure of what was about to happen. The man, standing behind his dog, grinned, believing that the guard would finally react. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. The guard, who had been calm up to this point, would surely have to defend himself now. But what the man didn't expect was the royal guard's response. Without flinching, without even blinking, the guard remained as still as a statue. His eyes didn't leave the path in front of him. His posture didn't change, and not a single muscle twitched. It was as though he had prepared for this very moment. The dog, now just a few feet away, barked louder, and showed no signs of slowing down. It was clear that the animal was trained to act on command, and it had no hesitation in attacking. But the royal guard was no ordinary man. He had been trained for moments like this, moments where control was the most powerful weapon. The dog continued to charge, but instead of responding with anger or fear, the guard's response was calm and calculated. He did not take his eyes off the dog, and he moved only when it was absolutely necessary. His hands remained at his sides, not making any quick movements that could provoke the dog further. With surprising agility, the guard stepped sideways, allowing the dog to pass by him without coming into contact. The dog, still in full attack mode, tried to turn and return to its target, but the guard, with precise timing, stepped back just far enough to maintain a safe distance, keeping his calm presence between the dog and himself. The crowd watched, captivated by what they were witnessing. Many had never seen anything like it. The man, on the other hand, started to feel uneasy. He had expected the guard to react. He had expected to see fear, or at least some sign of a struggle. But the guard's unshakable calm was disorienting. Instead of backing down, the guard remained firm, steady in his place, refusing to be intimidated by either the dog or the man. His professionalism and composure were evident, and it was clear that this was a man who had been trained for far more intense situations than this. The dog continued to circle the guard, but it no longer seemed as certain of its target. The initial rush of aggression was fading, replaced with confusion. It could sense that the guard was not afraid and was not going to fight back. The dog hesitated, its pace slowing. It was still barking loudly, but its movements became less coordinated, as though it was unsure of what to do next. The man, realizing that his plan was failing, began to shout again. This time, his words were more desperate, his voice rising in anger as he tried to command his dog to attack once more. But the royal guard didn't waver. His focus was unwavering, and he maintained a steady position, watching both the dog and the man with quiet authority. It was as if he was saying without words that no matter what happened, he was in control of the situation. And it was in this moment that the power of his calmness started to have an effect on everyone around him, including the man and the dog. The crowd, still in shock, was beginning to understand that the guard's strength wasn't in his physical power, but in his ability to stay composed in the face of extreme pressure. The dog, now unsure of itself, hesitated for a moment. It stopped in its tracks, its head turning back and forth. Its ears perked up as it tried to understand what was going on. It had been trained to attack, but the guard's calmness and lack of fear were something the dog had never encountered before. The large animal growled softly, still unsure about whether to charge or retreat. The tension in the air was thick, and the crowd watched in complete silence, wondering what would happen next. Despite the dog's confusion, the man on the other side was becoming more agitated, his face flushed red with frustration. He had expected the guard to react. After all, what kind of soldier would just stand there and let a dog charge at them? But this royal guard wasn't like anyone the man had dealt with before. The guard wasn't just standing still out of fear or lack of reaction. It was clear he was controlling the situation with his calm presence. He wasn't allowing himself to be drawn into the chaos. The man shouted at the dog, trying to regain control of the situation, but his words only seemed to make the dog more confused. It growled again, but now it was looking back at its owner, almost as if asking for guidance. The dog, normally confident and trained for such attacks, was starting to back away slightly, sensing that its usual tactics weren't working. For a brief moment, it looked at the royal guard, its gaze shifting from aggression to uncertainty. The guard, still standing firm, slowly and deliberately moved his left foot a step back, maintaining his steady posture. It was a small movement, but it was enough to subtly guide the dog away from him, without ever making any sudden or threatening motions. He had learned, through his extensive training, that the key to handling such situations wasn't in force or speed, but in timing and control. His stillness was the strongest signal he could send to the dog, and by doing nothing, he was showing the dog that it was not in charge of this situation. The man, still yelling at the dog, was growing increasingly desperate. He pulled at the leash, trying to get his dog to move forward again, but the dog seemed to have lost its earlier confidence. It hesitated, and with each passing second, its hesitation grew more obvious. It was clear that the dog wasn't sure what to do. The man's anger only grew, but his dog seemed to be losing its focus. In that moment, it became obvious to the crowd that the guard wasn't just standing still out of indifference. He was making the dog question its own actions. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, started to murmur amongst themselves. Some people whispered to each other in disbelief, while others looked on with admiration for the guard's incredible ability to stay calm in the face of such tension. The man had expected the guard to be the one who would lose control, but instead, it was his own dog that was becoming unsure. It was a rare and surprising turn of events. For the first time since the dog had been released, the man began to feel a slight pang of doubt. The situation wasn't going the way he had planned. He had expected the guard to react with fear or anger, to make a mistake that would allow him to feel superior. But instead, it was the guard who was in control, and the dog, once a symbol of aggression, was now retreating into confusion. The man, who had thought he was in charge of the situation, now realized that he had miscalculated. What he didn't realize was that his actions had unwittingly set the stage for an entirely different outcome than he had imagined. The dog, still uncertain and unsure of what to do, began to back away from the royal guard, its tail slightly tucked between its legs. It had never faced a situation like this before, where its usual intimidation tactics weren't having the desired effect. Instead of charging forward, as it had been trained to do, the dog slowly circled the guard, its eyes now darting back and forth. Its growls were quieter now, almost as if it was trying to figure out how to respond to the calmness it saw before it. The royal guard, standing completely still, made no move to break the silence. His face remained expressionless, and his eyes never left the path ahead of him. He wasn't concerned with the dog, nor was he bothered by the man's angry shouts. He knew that his role wasn't to fight or engage in any confrontation. It was to protect and remain composed at all costs. The guard had been trained in countless situations like this, each one designed to test his patience and resolve, and he wasn't about to let this man or his dog throw him off track. The crowd, who had initially been holding their breath, started to realize that something unusual was happening. The situation had taken a surprising turn. It wasn't the guard who was losing control, but the dog, and even the man. People began to whisper to each other, commenting on the incredible self-control the guard was displaying. They had expected a dramatic clash or a display of physical force, but what they were witnessing was far more powerful, a calmness that had somehow disarmed the situation. The man, still pulling at the leash, was beginning to lose his temper. His face was twisted with frustration, and his voice grew louder with each command he gave to his dog. But the dog, now unsure of its orders, wasn't responding as quickly as the man wanted. The animal's hesitation was becoming more apparent, and the man's anger was building. It was clear that he hadn't expected his dog to act this way. He had assumed that the royal guard would be the one to falter under the pressure, but instead, it was his own dog that was losing its confidence. The man looked around, noticing the growing attention from the crowd, and he began to feel self-conscious. His plan to create a scene was falling apart. The royal guard, still maintaining his steady position, didn't acknowledge the man's increasingly agitated behavior. Instead, he focused on keeping the dog in check. He knew that this wasn't about reacting or engaging in a fight. It was about maintaining control. The guard's training was designed to prepare him for moments like this, where staying calm and unwavering was the most important thing. He had been taught to be unshakable, to let no outside force disrupt his focus. Slowly, as the moments passed, the dog began to calm down. Its barking grew quieter, and its movements became slower and more deliberate. It seemed to realize that its usual display of aggression wasn't working. The man, still pulling on the leash, was now fully aware that things weren't going according to plan. He shouted at the dog one last time, but the animal, now more subdued, stood still, no longer focused on the guard. The tension in the air began to lessen, and the crowd, which had been waiting for something dramatic to happen, began to relax as well. In that quiet moment, something changed. The man's anger, which had been so strong just moments before, began to dissipate as he realized that no matter what he did, the guard was not going to be moved. He had hoped to provoke a reaction, to see the guard break his composure, but it was clear now that this wasn't going to happen. The royal guard's presence had completely neutralized the situation, simply by being unmovable and calm in the face of everything thrown at him. This part continues to build the story, highlighting the guard's unwavering calmness and control over the situation, while the man becomes more frustrated. Let me know if you'd like to tweak anything. As the moments stretched on, the man began to notice something he hadn't anticipated. The situation was slowly slipping out of his control. His dog, once so aggressive and sure of its purpose, was now standing still, confused and uncertain. The barking had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that hung in the air. The man pulled harder on the leash, trying to command his dog to move forward again, but it didn't respond. It simply stood there, looking up at him with its head tilted slightly to one side, as though trying to understand why its usual tactics weren't working. The frustration began to build in the man. His hands gripped the leash tightly, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't understand why the guard hadn't reacted. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. He had expected the royal guard to be just another target for his anger, someone he could intimidate or challenge. But the guard, still standing perfectly still, wasn't reacting at all. It was as if the guard wasn't even aware of the insults or the dog charging toward him. His unshakable calmness was beginning to have an effect on the man, whether he realized it or not. The crowd around them had started to take notice of the shift in the situation. Some were murmuring, others simply watching in awe. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. It was clear that the man's attempts to provoke the guard were not succeeding, and the tension that had once filled the air was now being replaced by a sense of confusion. The man's angry words no longer seemed to hold the same power over the guard as they once did. Instead, the man was the one beginning to feel small and out of place. It was in this moment that the man began to realize something important. He had been so focused on trying to provoke the guard, so certain that he would break, that he hadn't stopped to think about the power of calmness. The guard's silence, his unwavering composure, was far more powerful than any angry words or gestures. It was as if the royal guard's quiet strength was slowly breaking down the man's own anger. He had been so intent on making the guard react that he hadn't considered the possibility that the guard might simply ignore him and his dog altogether. As the man stood there, pulling on the leash in frustration, the dog seemed to grow even more uncertain. The animal, once filled with confidence, now looked back at its owner with a sense of hesitation. It wasn't sure what was expected of it anymore. The dog had been trained for aggression, for action, but this wasn't a situation it could handle in the usual way. The more the dog looked at the guard, the more it seemed to realize that this wasn't a battle it could win. There was no fear in the guard's eyes, no anger to respond to. All that was left was a quiet strength that the dog couldn't understand. The crowd watched, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others beginning to applaud softly as they recognized the power of the guard's response. It wasn't about fighting back, about showing force. It was about the strength to remain calm and composed, no matter the situation. And in that moment, the royal guard had shown exactly that. He had neutralized the man's anger simply by not allowing it to affect him. The man, who had once been so confident in his actions, now stood at a crossroads. His plan had failed, and his dog wasn't responding to him anymore. There was a moment of realization, a brief pause, where he understood that no matter how hard he tried, the guard wasn't going to give him the reaction he had been hoping for. Instead of feeling victorious, The man began to feel a deep sense of embarrassment, his anger slowly fading away as he stood there, realizing that this quiet soldier had shown him a lesson in strength that he hadn't expected. This section delves deeper into the shift in the man's emotions, from frustration to realization, highlighting the power of calmness and control. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments or additions. The man, now standing in front of the royal guard, could feel his anger starting to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of confusion. His dog, once full of aggression and energy, was now quietly standing by his side, its tail between its legs. It seemed to have given up on the idea of attacking the guard, and instead, it was now looking at its owner, almost pleading for some kind of direction. The man had been so focused on his own anger, so sure that he would be able to provoke a reaction from the guard, that he hadn't noticed how things were slowly shifting in the opposite direction. He tugged once more on the leash, trying to get his dog to move, but it simply didn't respond. The dog, which had always followed his commands without question, now stood still, clearly unsettled by the situation. The more the man tried to force it, the more the dog seemed to retreat into its own uncertainty. He had expected to control the situation, to make the guard feel threatened, but instead, it was as if he and his dog had been the ones who had been neutralized. The crowd around him had started to take notice of the change. People were no longer whispering in disbelief about the man's behavior or wondering what would happen next. Instead, they were watching with a sense of quiet admiration for the royal guard's composure. The guard hadn't lifted a finger. He hadn't said a word. But somehow, through his stillness, he had taken control of the situation in a way that no one had expected. The man's frustration was now turning into something else, something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was a sense of respect, or perhaps it was just the realization that he had been outmatched in a way he hadn't thought possible. The man glanced around at the faces in the crowd, some of whom were now nodding in agreement with the way the situation had unfolded. He had been the center of attention, but now, as he stood there with his dog, he felt out of place. It was as if the guard had not only neutralized the dog's aggression, but had also quietly shifted the power dynamic. The guard hadn't needed to do anything other than remain calm, and now it was clear that the man was the one who had been made to look foolish. As the man stood there, trying to understand what had just happened, the dog gave one last hesitant glance at the guard. It was almost as if the animal was trying to understand why it had been so aggressive in the first place. For the first time since the dog had been released, it seemed to realize that the guard posed no threat. The dog had been trained to act on command, to respond to aggression with aggression, but in this moment, the dog seemed to be reevaluating its response. The guard's stillness and quiet strength had changed the dog's behavior without a single word or action. The man finally let go of the leash, and it fell loosely to his side. He looked down at his dog, who stood beside him, no longer acting as if it were ready to pounce. The tension in the air had begun to fade, and the man couldn't help but feel a strange sense of humility. He had tried to make the guard react, but instead, the guard had done something far more powerful. He had shown him that sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. The guard, still standing in his perfect position, never moved a muscle. His calmness had not only de-escalated the situation, but had also left the man wondering if he had misjudged the power of self-control. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to disperse, some of them glancing at the man with a quiet sense of disbelief, while others seemed to be reflecting on the lessons they had just witnessed. The royal guard had, without lifting a finger or uttering a word, demonstrated a kind of strength that had left a lasting impression on everyone watching. This part explores the change in the man's emotions, his shift from frustration to a quieter reflection, and the guard's continued control over the situation. It also touches on the idea of power through calmness and how it has affected the crowd. Let me know if you'd like to continue or adjust anything. As the crowd began to disperse, the man stood there, silently observing the scene around him. His dog, now calm and subdued, remained by his side, its earlier aggression completely gone. The leash hung loosely in his hand, and for the first time, the man felt a strange sense of emptiness. He had come to the palace with one goal in mind: to provoke the royal guard, to get a reaction from him, to show the people that he was in control. But instead, he found himself standing there, completely defeated, with nothing to say or do. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The guard's unshakable calmness had broken through the walls of his anger and frustration. The man had expected to overpower the guard with his behavior, to make the guard lose his composure. Instead, it was the man who had been the one to lose control. The royal guard had not raised his voice, had not moved an inch, and yet he had outperformed the man in every way. The man's frustration was now giving way to self-reflection. He thought back to his earlier actions, how he had tried to rile up the dog, how he had shouted insults, how he had believed that he could force the guard into a reaction. But all of it had been for nothing. The guard had never flinched, never responded with anger or aggression. Instead, he had stood his ground, using nothing more than his presence and stillness to completely neutralize the situation. The man had expected the guard to break, to lose his composure, but what he didn't realize was that the guard's calmness had been the most powerful weapon of all. As the man stood there, trying to make sense of it all, the crowd's murmurs started to quiet down. People were no longer focused on him or his dog. Instead, they were focused on the royal guard, who had maintained his stoic posture throughout the entire ordeal. Some of them, who had been spectators of the confrontation, now nodded in silent respect, recognizing the strength it took to stay composed in the face of such aggression. The man had set out to make a spectacle, but in the end, it was the guard who had commanded attention and respect. The royal guard remained in his position, still as a statue, his eyes forward, his uniform perfectly pressed. He hadn't shown a flicker of emotion, and that had been his greatest strength. The man, on the other hand, was left standing with nothing but his own thoughts, the leash in his hand, and a dog that no longer seemed interested in the conflict. The energy in the air had shifted completely. What had started as a tense, charged encounter had now dissolved into a quiet understanding that power didn't always need to be displayed with force or anger. Sometimes, the greatest power lay in holding your ground and remaining calm in the face of adversity. As the man slowly walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of the realization, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of humility. He had been so focused on trying to create a reaction, to prove that he could make the guard lose control, that he hadn't noticed the true power in the guard's response. The quiet, unwavering strength that had come from simply standing firm had been the very thing that had neutralized the situation. The dog, walking beside its owner now, seemed to have forgotten all about the earlier confrontation. Its head was low, its pace slow and unhurried, no longer the aggressive animal it had been moments ago. The man glanced at it, and then looked back at the royal guard, who still stood motionless. The guard had not only taught him a lesson in patience, but had also shown him the value of self-control. It was a lesson he would not soon forget. This part focuses on the man's internal change, moving from frustration to humility, and underscores the power of calmness in overcoming challenges. Let me know if you need any further adjustments or additions. As the man walked away from the scene, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions swirling inside him. His pride had been wounded, but there was something else, a sense of respect for the royal guard, something he hadn't expected to feel. The anger that had driven him to act the way he had was fading with every step, replaced by a quiet understanding of just how powerful composure and calmness could be. He had wanted to make the guard react, to force a response out of him, but in the end, it was the man who had been changed by the encounter. The dog, which had been the source of so much tension just moments ago, now walked calmly beside him. Its tail was no longer raised in aggression, but rather hung relaxed by its side. It seemed almost as if the dog, too, had learned something from the experience. There was no longer the urge to charge, no longer the sharp bark or the readiness to fight. Instead, it was a quiet companion, walking at its owner's side, as though it too had understood that aggression was not always the answer. As they continued down the path, the man found himself reflecting on what had happened. The royal guard had taught him an important lesson, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't about the loudest voice or the most powerful display of force. It wasn't about winning or losing a battle. Sometimes, the strongest thing a person could do was simply to remain calm, to not let anything shake their inner peace. The guard had not reacted to the insults or the threats. He hadn't moved a muscle, and yet he had won the situation without ever needing to raise his voice. The man now understood that the real strength lay in that silence, in that stillness. The guard had known that he didn't need to fight or prove anything. His presence alone had been enough to control the situation. It was a power that came from within, one that couldn't be taken away or broken by external forces. The more the man thought about it, the more he realized that this was a lesson he had never considered before. He had always thought that to be strong meant to react, to fight back, to overpower others. But now he saw that true strength came from the ability to stay calm and unshaken, no matter what challenges came your way. As he walked further away, the man glanced back one last time toward the royal guard, who was still standing in his place, unmoving, a symbol of patience and control. There was no anger in the guard's stance, no judgment, just an unwavering calmness that was somehow more powerful than anything the man had tried to do. The crowd had scattered, but the man could sense that their perception of what had happened had shifted. It was clear now that the guard had not only diffused the situation, but had left an impression on everyone who had witnessed it. No one in the crowd would soon forget the image of the calm, composed royal guard standing tall in the face of aggression. And as for the man, he couldn't help but feel that he had learned something far more valuable than he had intended. He had come to try to humiliate someone, to prove a point, but instead he had been taught the true meaning of strength. With a final glance at the guard, the man turned away. He had no need to prove anything anymore. The lesson had been learned, and he would carry it with him, a reminder that sometimes silence and stillness were the most powerful responses. This final part brings the story to a reflective and insightful conclusion, showing the lasting impact of the encounter on the man, as well as his newfound respect for the royal guard's calmness. Let me know if you'd like to make any adjustments.